Long before modern religion rose from the sands of the Middle East, a brutal and mysterious pantheon held sway over the lives and deaths of the Canaanite people, who worshipped gods so cruel, so cryptically complex that their stories have been obscured by time and buried in layers of theological shame. But those with deep gnosis, the spiritual insiders who seek forbidden knowledge, know that these esoteric gods were never truly gone, only masked, renamed, or absorbed into later mythologies. At the center of their blackened cosmology was El, the father of the gods, an ancient deity not of love and light, but of age, authority, and occasionally terrifying indifference, who ruled a divine council that included gods like Baal and Anat, not simple archetypes but violent, carnal, and wildly unpredictable entities that fed off war, sacrifice, and the bleeding heart of human devotion. Baal, often miscast as just a weather god, was far more a storm-wielding tyrant of the heavens who battled Leviathan-like sea monsters and demanded thunderous recognition, even if it meant crops failed or people died. He was worshipped in shrines drenched in blood and sex, and he was considered powerful enough to challenge even death itself, whom the Canaanites knew as Moloch, a god so dreadful and all-consuming that he wasn't merely the absence of life, but the eater of souls, the devourer of gods, and the endless tomb of all things, depicted not as a shadow or skeleton, but a living mouth, yawning with hunger, his breath a rot that brought ruin. When Baal defied Moloch, he paid with his life temporarily until he was resurrected in a grim cosmic cycle that mirrored the endless rising and falling of civilizations, seas, and even human sanity itself. But where Baal was feared and praised, the goddess Anat was pure fury incarnate, a war goddess who bathed in blood, split the heads of armies, and rejoiced in the slaughter of thousands, yet was paradoxically seen as youthful and beautiful, her eroticism forever entangled with her violence, proving that in this pantheon, creation and destruction were never far apart. She mutilated enemies with surgical glee, laughing as she wore their entrails like trophies, and in one infamous myth, she slaughters countless men in such a rage that her knees, arms, and neck are soaked in gore, and she calmly washes off in a river as if nothing had happened. Because nothing had in the eyes of these gods, morality was not a currency in the Canaanite spiritual economy, only power, terror, devotion, and blood. Even Asherah, later sanitized into the biblical groves or erased entirely, was originally a queen of heaven, a sensual and nurturing mother figure, but also the consort of El and the origin of divine life. Her statues often paired with phallic symbols, revealing that fertility and death were twin threads in this tapestry of Gnosis. While worshippers begged for rain, harvest, and fertility, they also offered firstborn children to Moloch, a towering brass monstrosity with outstretched arms and a burning belly, where infants were laid as drums drowned their screams and smoke rose into the dead sky, an act not done in desperation, but in sacred ritual, meant to please a god who thrived on unbearable cost. Moloch was not a metaphor, not a symbol. He was a force, an entity so real to his followers that entire cities built altars to him, and the idea of appeasing his appetite with mere prayer was laughable. This was Gnosis that came with a price, terrifying insight into the cruelty of divinity, where proximity to the gods meant suffering, not salvation. And it's important to realize the Canaanites weren't primitive or foolish. They understood nature and society as harsh, cyclical, and governed by the whims of forces beyond their control, and their gods were mirrors of that truth. Capricious, violent, sexual, and cosmic, the esoteric traditions passed down in fragments through Ugaritic texts, temple carvings, and the encoded whispers of mystics, reveal a worldview where Gnosis wasn't about enlightenment, but about survival in a cosmos ruled by divine predators, where to know the gods was to bleed for them, fear them, and sometimes, if you were lucky, become momentarily one with their terrible will. And even as Canaanite religion was gradually crushed by the rise of Yahwism and later monotheism, the deep darker spirits of these deities bled into those new belief systems. Baal became a demon, Asherah became an unspoken absence, Anat faded into shadows, and Moloch was demonized but never fully forgotten, surfacing in occult texts and even political metaphors as a stand-in for industrial sacrifice and state-sanctioned horror. Yet modern esoteric circles, especially those drawn to chaos magic, left-hand path traditions, and Near Eastern occultism, have begun reclaiming these beings, not to glorify their violence, but to embrace the raw, unfiltered spiritual reality they represent. To some practitioners, Baal is a storm of psychic energy, Anat a living avatar of divine feminine wrath, and Moloch an archetype of sacrifice and transformation, so potent it still influences subconscious fears today. Through ritual invocation, pathworking, or meditative descent into ancient texts, they seek contact with these gods, not as saviors, but as cosmic truths. To walk into their realm is to leave behind the comfort of order and morality, and instead encounter Gnosis as it truly is, savage and profoundly real. This isn't a journey for the faint of heart. When you study the cruelest gods of Canaan, you're not just learning about myth, you're inviting something ancient and primal into your mind, something that views your existence not as sacred, but as a vessel of energy, a transaction of blood and fire. And while mainstream theology casts these beings into the underworld, labeling them demons or false idols, the esoteric path knows that such condemnations are often veils meant to hide dangerous truths. Truths that our ancestors knew viscerally as they knelt before blazing altars or watched their kings weep at the feet of horned idols. This is not just mythology, it's ancestral trauma, spiritual memory encoded in the DNA of civilizations, and the deeper you study it, the more the line blurs between metaphor and manifestation. Whether you see these gods as literal entities, psychic forces, or mythic archetypes, the gnosis they offer is undeniable, that creation is not pure, that the divine is not kind, and that to truly understand the cosmos, you must face the horror at its core without flinching, because only in that terrifying confrontation with gods who drink blood, whisper madness, and wear crowns of bone can you begin to awaken to the deepest spiritual knowledge of all, that power does not come from love or mercy, but from the raw, unspeakable current that pulses beneath all existence, and that sometimes to know the divine is to suffer under it. But what happens when that raw current, the unspeakable gnosis of the cruel gods, begins to awaken not just in texts and rituals, but in the collective unconscious of modern humanity? Beneath the fragile illusion of progress, beneath the comforting blanket of sanitized religion and sterile science, there are cracks in the structure of human belief, where these ancient entities whisper once more, uninvited but never unwelcome to those attuned to chaos. El's cold omnipotence now moves through global bureaucracies and faceless institutions that play God with lives from distant towers. The divine patriarch, once seated atop Mount Zauven, now rules from corporate skyscrapers and war rooms, his judgment as indifferent as stone, his silence as deafening as space. Baal, who once hurled lightning and demanded thunderous offerings, now manifests in the hunger for conquest, in climate fury, in the storm of endless war that ravages both land and soul. His worshippers don't chant beneath open skies anymore. They scream in digital forums, sacrifice in financial markets, and build empires of steel in his name. Moat. The Eater of Souls has found new forms in pharmaceutical epidemics, psychological decay, and the cult of nihilism that feeds on disconnection and spiritual rote. He no longer needs temples, he thrives in silence, in screens, in the slow erosion of purpose. And Anat, once a blood-soaked goddess of ecstasy and slaughter, is alive in the cult of violence as spectacle, in the eroticization of brutality. In every instance where death is not just delivered but celebrated, proof that the sacred feminine can still wear the mask of vengeance. These gods are not dead. They are simply unrecognized, unnamed by a world that believes itself too evolved to kneel, but too broken to stand. The terrifying truth of Canaanite Gnosis is that these deities were not flawed gods. They were accurate reflections of an indifferent, predatory cosmos. To touch their energy now is to see modern civilization for what it is. A rebranded altar drenched in digital blood, humming with artificial chants, and lit by the blue glow of sacrificial screens. And the deeper one descends into their mythic darkness, the more obvious it becomes that monotheism didn't banish these gods. It hid them in plain sight, embedding their essence in saints, demons, and ideologies that offer order but deliver sacrifice. Moloch, the devourer of children, is now whispered through machines of war and systems of poverty, where the young are still fed to furnaces. Only now they are metaphorical, made of policy and profit. The gnosis these gods offer is not just spiritual, it is historical, psychological, and existential. It reveals that behind every clean narrative lies an altar, behind every savior a shadow, and behind every moral system a hierarchy of power, etched in blood. And those brave or cursed enough to walk the left-hand path, to embrace the truths behind the veils, discover a world that doesn't reward virtue but respects force, not kindness but will. Chaos magicians, esoteric historians, and spiritual renegades have begun invoking these forgotten deities not to romanticize their cruelty, but to reclaim a form of spiritual authenticity that mainstream religion cannot provide. In their rituals, Baal is no longer a false god, but a source of storm-summoning power. Anat is a protector of the fierce feminine who does not apologize for her rage. El is the distant architect of realities too vast and merciless to comprehend. Asherah is reborn as the serpent mother, coiled in hidden groves of ancestral memory. This reclamation is not about faith. It's about confrontation. It's about looking into the abyss and recognizing the gods that live there as real, not because they were worshipped, but because their energies never ceased to influence the patterns of human behavior, the structures of power, and the rituals of death. To awaken to this gnosis is to unlearn comfort and descend into the deeper layers of awareness, where myth and memory become indistinguishable, where the gods are not external beings, but internal truths. Archetypal forces embedded in the human condition. The Canaanites may be gone, but their gods still walk among us, not in form but in function. Every sacrifice made in silence, every war waged in pride, every child lost to systemic greed, these are their new hymns, their new offering. The blood no longer pools in temple courts, but it flows in data, in capital, in consent. And as esoteric practitioners continue to unearth Ugaritic texts, reinterpret ritual symbols, and seek communion with forgotten pantheons, a new spiritual reality begins to take shape, one that does not seek light for comfort, but dives into shadow for understanding. This reality knows that power has never been moral, that the divine has never been merciful, and that true spiritual evolution comes not through worship, but through the terrifying process of embodying what was once feared. To truly follow the gnosis of the cruelest gods is to abandon hope as a currency, and instead trade in will, insight, and endurance. Because the gods of Canaan never offered redemption. They offered truth, unfiltered and unapologetic, and perhaps that is why their memory was buried, why their names were demonized, and why their myths were distorted into monstrous echoes, because to know them is to be changed, not saved. To speak their names is to peel back the illusion of safety and see the pulsing, ancient engine of existence in its rawest form. And for those who dare to make that descent, who dare to read their stories not as mythology but as mirrors, the reward is not comfort, but power, not protection but perspective, not heaven, but the clarity to navigate hell with your eyes open and your spirit ablaze.